So you heard a lot of Rails in that introduction, and I apologize. There's not much Python, and there's 0 Rails in this, so I think we're going to be okay. So an interesting thing happened this morning. My presentation, which is 45 minutes, disappeared completely. So I gave this talk in a much shorter version in Melbourne a few months ago, and we're going to use that version, which means that we're going to free up a whole bunch of time for Q&A afterwards. And it happens that I love Q&A, and I have a lot of stuff stuck in my head, and I hope that you guys will have lots of questions so we can use that time really well. So let us begin. So in addition to being that developer, I'm also a sex educator. And I think a lot about how these two things interlap, and they do quite a lot. Imagine walking through the world knowing that everyone's first assumptions about how you see yourself, who you love, what feels right for you, that they're all completely wrong. Now imagine signing up for a cool website and then being required to select an option from a drop-down menu that doesn't include anything that represents you at all. You'll feel defeated. You'll want to argue that whatever they think they're learning from that drop-down menu, it's not really true. You'll want to tell them that they're adding to your humiliation by making you do this. You'll want to tell them that they're missing a huge part of you. There we go. So users are giving pushback to assumptions that leave them out, and social apps in particular have been pressed to adjust. Facebook, Google, others, they're all dealing with these questions and have been for many years, and they're still working it out. So if you feel out of depth with these questions, you're not alone. So we're going to look at how you can deal with that. We've got this idea that normalization of data is just the bestest thing ever, which works out fine if all you want are users who are among that little elite who belong to your idealized norm that you're seeking. But most of us, in fact, are going for a much broader user base than that, right? We want everyone to participate and enjoy. So one of the objectives of database normalization is to mirror real-world concepts and their interrelationships. This is one of the core precepts of normalization. And when that database is in tension with the real world, then it's not the user who's the one that has to change. It's us. So why is this stuff so hard? Is because at first glance, it looks so easy. So we're fooled. We think it's just forms, right? And we've done that a million times before. So we get tripped up with some flawed premises. First, that things that are deeply personal about humans can be reduced to lists. Second, that our assumptions are that canonical lists for these things do exist, or at least surely they can be created. And the third is our faith that the first two problems here can easily be solved by just adding more list items. Hang on. We'll get there. Any minute. This is a real list. This is British Airways. They don't do this anymore. Now they're down to like 20. And you notice how they had to solve this by putting the first couple of ones over again because they realized people were getting to the end and just wanted to have, like Mr., Mrs., whatever, doctor, let's keep this simple. So they knew in their hearts that more list items wasn't the solution, and they did it anyway. So we know that this is not going to work, and it really risks making us look foolish. So that next flawed premise is that we intuitively understand the nature of social networks, that we understand that definition. And when we step aside from that term that's been implemented as a technology and just think about the human concept, what is a social network? What do we mean by that? Well, in real life, it's our apps being personal, replicating and building upon who we are, how we relate to each other, what our social world is, the bonds that we create and want to maintain. It's all that one-on-one stuff. And as personal as our social lives get. So in social, identity is a dependency itself. So as developers, we build or we break that community with each line of code. What one-to-one relationships are we fostering? What relationships are we inhibiting between our app, between ourselves, between users? In real life, I know your personhood better than you do sounds so presumptuous, right? We do that. In real life, who you are is invalid sounds arrogant. We do validations all the time. In real life, your existence isn't possible sounds pretty clueless and ignores the obvious that you are. This is not what we set out to do. It's not the user experience that we want to give. It's not the community that we're seeking to build. We want to create things that feel cutting edge, not that seem out of touch. Postel's law tells us, be conservative in what you do and be liberal in what you accept from others. So how do we bring reality into the data, views, our logic? And that's by starting at schema. As developers, we get tugged in these two different directions. We want to keep the code base manageable, but we also need to design for reality, complexity, the messiness of humans. So we have to get schemas into alignment. And when I say schemas, I mean there's two different kinds. One is our mental schema. It's a psychological and philosophical idea. It's a belief system about how the world works, and it's personal. It's our set of preconceived ideas, and it's our mental framework for representing whatever aspect of the world we're trying to model in a database. It's our personal filter, and thus has the limitations of the individual creating it. Whereas database schemas are basically just the same thing manifest into SQL or whatever you're using. It's just taking that idea, that belief system, and imprinting it on a database. So here are some different front-end manifestations of individuals, different schemas. We've got a lot of variation. Schemas can be a foundation for expressing things that are deeply intimate. Self-image, our identity, our important relationships, our sense of values, and even our spirit, our creativeness, our very uniqueness. And by all that, they're defining our user experience. And it's the schemas that are leaving behind that user experience. But that's the part that we can fix by asking questions like, what benefit will the user notice? Not letting ourselves off the hook by saying, what will be great? How is this feature going to be awesome and serve them well? Because that's coming from our bias. They really need to think in terms of what they're getting out of it. So we can evaluate that user perspective from a couple of different angles, and that will give us some focus for making decisions. There's no point on this chart where everybody's going to see maximum benefit. It's all about trade-offs. So we can look at the different choices. Checkboxes, radio buttons, select menus, they all imply that every possible value is represented. So we're saying to users, pick the one right one. If checkboxes, sure, maybe multiple right ones, but we're still saying we've got all the answers. All you have to do is pick them out. It's the real world that's being rejected because it doesn't happen to look like our personal mental schema. So checking a box is that one-step action, and it's really convenient. Entering a text string takes more work. It's not nearly as accessible. So that free-form solution of a text area or a text field is not automatically exciting and does have its own drawbacks, but it can also deliver benefit to the users. Pardon me. At Metafilter, gender has been a text field for over a decade. And initially, there were people who utterly shuddered at this thought. A lot of members of the community are programmers themselves and hated this idea. For about 5 seconds, and then they jumped on board because they got to be creative and silly and honest and real. And they got to express this one thing about themselves fully for once. an authentic voice. So that text field has grown into a beloved institution. And what you as a user put into that field says something really revealing about who you are. And that you're allowed to put in anything, that you're trusted to do that, says something revealing about what Metafilter as a community is meant to be for. So that's a Schemas trust in users, and it's a foundation for users, in this case, to ask for a lot more. How often do you see an app where the users are saying, please, please, let me disclose more about myself. Let me share with you everything that's personal, that normally we really hate to have scraped from us. So today, Metafilter's users are trusted with a lot of free-form fills, including ones that most of us would usually try to constrain or validate. Even really nonsensical values are fine. So you can have field values that are blatantly contradictory, that are just absolutely crazy, and there's no objection. The message is, users, we get this. It's your community. It's your home. So make it as comfortable and personal and messy as you want, because we can handle that. When we're collecting data on people, we're in a different realm. We're not in computer science, we're in social science. And in the world of social science, if you want to run useful research and analytics about personal attributes and behavior, then your data collection needs to be a little different. It's got to meet two minimum criteria. The first is that a field's values must include every possible option. This is called exhaustive. And the other is that the options must be truly mutually exclusive. If there's overlap, you have failed. So how many social apps have both of those bare minimum criteria actually covered? We've seen this one plenty of times, right? And it's a set of values that seems to cover things pretty well, right? Pretty exhaustive, pretty exclusive. No overlap there, right? Well, you could argue about bisexual. It's not. There's lots of ways to represent sexual orientation. They're all reasonable, they're all valid. Some of them are expanding on each other, some are variations in thought. We're not going to get there by adding more list items. That British Airways list, this is where we're headed, where we just keep on adding things because we think that we can finally get to the end. Instead, we can choose to look at human data from a really different perspective. That data doesn't have to be purely for analysis. We can step back and we can wallow in the user's perspective. That for them, it can be sheer expressiveness about their character, their individualism, their personal distinctiveness. At Diaspora, another social network, they also turned gender into a text field. Now I apologize, you're going to see some Ruby. Don't be scared. So more recently, Diaspora's Sarah May did that change to a text field, and just like on Metafilter, users really went to town with this. They really got to express all the things that they'd been waiting to do, some of which they didn't even know they wanted to do until they had the chance to be silly. Of course, there are developers who are not amused by that. The difference is that Metafilter is a community built by essentially one person. Whereas Diaspora is open source, it had a heck of a lot of contributors. It was dealing with internationalization, a problem that Metafilter doesn't have. And a big complaint was that this affects internationalization of gendered pronouns. If you don't know whether there's male or female, what do you know about internationalization of pronouns, right? Here's what I have to say about that. It's a rat hole, don't go down it, it's hell. It gets messy really fast once you're dealing with internationalization because the way we think pronouns work in other languages isn't actually how they work. And I see a bunch of heads shaking, you know. It's a plan that comes with such a level of complexity English has not wrapped its head around at all. In a lot of non-English languages, grammatical gender and what you and I would call gender are completely independent of each other. It's not something we can extrapolate from male or female. So internationalization that's based on that idea is always going to fail. It was already a problem. But we could do something about that. So Randall Munroe is best known as the source of XKCD, and he's also a physicist. He's a pretty bright guy. And he's examined this problem a number of times for English language projects, and finally asking straight up, which pronouns do you prefer, was truly the best approach that he could come up with at all. And as complicated as this might seem, it gets a whole lot worse in other languages. Now I want to address one of the things here that people see, that third line down, they, them, their, and they get kind of horrified. That can't possibly be a singular pronoun, right? We all got taught that in English class? Wrong. It's been a singular pronoun for 400 years. Shakespeare says so, Chaucer, Lewis Carroll, Jane Austen. Actually, so does Facebook. So, you know, we got the whole range of possibilities covered there. As developers, we have a vision of what a good code base should be and what it should not be. In the most sensible of ways, we often arrive at solutions that are factually truthy, but they're really far removed from real life. So we have this urge to have things that are structured, that are predictable. We want things that are nicely relational. We want indexes, right? We want to be able to search all this stuff. We think we're doing exhaustive, and we want all this data because we want to be able to analyze. We want to be able to draw conclusions. We want to be able to use this to monetize. We want to be able to make good decisions by having nice, clear, objective data. The thing is, we end up instead doing all these validations and throwing exceptions. And what we're really doing every time we try to validate human beings is we're actually invalidating who they are. So we're really being counterproductive. We do all these conditionals, you know, all the possibilities. Would you want to deal with all the possibilities of, say, that British Airways form, or even some of those sexual orientation ones? Do each of them have a different role in your app? We do all this premature optimization, you know, horrified that, well, we can't possibly just let go of constraints on, say, field length. You know, I mean, that would consume a lot of disk space, right? At the start of your app, this is not a problem. This is the opportunity to collect data on who's actually using your app, what they want to do with it. We can optimize for space later. So we have to acknowledge that there's cultural variability all over the place, and it's not just cultural, it's individual, and most importantly, it's changing throughout time. We're never going to get to the end and figure out, here's the one solution, here's the one way to deal with these values, here's the one set of answers. So we're making all these great data-driven decisions that are based on bad data. So ERIS is an ongoing survey of Americans' religious identification. It asks just one really simple question. What is your religion, if any? And that netted them over 100 unique answers, which they filtered down to a smaller number of answers. They compressed it down to 13 major categories, and you can see it's a lot easier to deal with than the 100. But, you know, we could use that in a form if we wanted to. Although, if you look at some of those numbers, some of them are kind of edge cases, right? We'd rather focus on the genuinely major values, get some nice big groupings, right? So we can bring it down to this, and at least a quarter of Americans turn out to be Christian of some denomination. So now we've got a pretty good set of data here that we can work with. Every other religion is really just clutter, edge cases. So, you know, we can let go of that. And then there's this sort of crummy data, right? I mean, don't know or refuse. I mean, if we have no information, that's basically a null, right? I mean, what are we going to do with that? So we can fix that problem. And now our numbers are starting to look really good and clear. So now we know what to do. It covers all the big stuff, right? Those 100 categories are represented here. And when you get reductive enough for Americans, religion is a binary. From a storage standpoint, this is so great, right? This is just a Boolean. Score. We don't do this. It covers the biggest categories, but we know this is really offensive. We know that this leaves a lot of people out, and they don't consider themselves edge cases. People are not edge cases, and they push back on apps that treat them that way. So trying to be reductive has all these big problems. At the same time, so does trying to scale upward. As engineers, it's instinctually uncomfortable to step away from this stuff, to deliberately not structure data for nice, easy, clean analysis. And, me too, I get uneasy. But again, that foundational question is not what benefits me as developer, what benefits are there to the user? What will they notice they're benefiting? And if necessary, we can strike some middle grounds. This is LinkedIn. Using guided response, auto-suggest. They've got what they think are a comprehensive set of values. They're wrong, but they're doing their best, and they're letting you put in another value if they still haven't managed to get everything there possibly is. So auto-suggest, that's that kind of balancing act. And when there's a subset of values that we're personally most interested in, that we think are the most relevant for what we want to accomplish, we can do some minimal auto-suggest instead. Just using auto-suggest, but starting off with just that handful of values that we think are the most useful, and then backing off as soon as they start writing something else. So it gives structure for those who want it, including us. And it also gives that freedom to have that sort of expressiveness for the people who want that. Structured data is there when we do that, and it's a balanced solution that in many cases where you're willing to tolerate some ambiguity can work really well. It seems like we would lose, all of that clarity, but actually a lot of people will still go for the clean defaults that we think are the best ones. But we also get to find out who doesn't and how they identify, and we can start to make adaptations that fit them. So we might have lower quantity data, but we're really getting higher quality. So you can do some mixing and matching and find the right approach for your users, your app's business objectives. This isn't about what's empirically right, it's about what's doing right for the needs. Facebook, for instance, they make relationship status completely optional, but they're pretty coercive if you do set a value. They give you a constrained list. So we do want everyone to feel excited about what we've built, and we want users to feel passionate about their involvement with what we've built. We want analytics, investments, monetization. These are all based on some sort of premise that that data is accurate. But the data that's been collected by those coercive approaches, those constrained ones like text, checkboxes and radios, they're all taking a risk that what we're really collecting is just garbage. That people are lying because they have to, that they've made that a requirement for even getting past their front door. So we're drawing conclusions from that bad data, and it ends up misdirecting our decision making. It's really contradictory to our goal. So those restrictive options, that stuff over on the bottom left, we don't actually have to make them required. The way we set up our schema is embedding assumptions constantly about what should be there and what we think has to be there. A field that's not allowed to be null at all is destined to become mandatory. A field that sets a very short length is asserting that any reasonable value is knowable and it will definitely fit in there. So this is making a lot of assertions. We can do less and serve users better. Making that null explicit is a communication to the team, to our future selves, whoever else is maintaining. It's a statement of intent. It's documentation that we meant for this to be optional. So now we have a discretionary field created in the schema itself. Whether to respond is going to be left up to the user. So let's say we really do have some sort of canonical set of list items for some of these things. This one looks pretty reasonable, right? I mean, we've even got some liberal stuff going on at the bottom, some sort of catch-all categories. This is 3 years ago, and Facebook really felt like they were doing well with this, that they'd finally solved some problems and gotten a pretty complete list. Users disagreed strongly. So under pressure, Facebook had to nearly double those list items in just 2 years. And once you look at it, these were also really reasonable values. They really should have been there all along. Google+, when they launched, largely adapted that list. They did make a few changes that I find interesting. And most importantly, they added what Facebook did not have, the option to say, I don't want to tell you. Allowing users to identify their relationships with labels of their greatest personal significance, all of that is being driven by users rejecting a user experience that doesn't work for them. How did some status seem universal while others weren't? Whenever we name a thing, we're creating scope. The assumed validity of a field's values is being constrained as soon as we name a field itself. Marital status. That's a field label right there, and it could lead to a particular list, such as this one. Everything's in relation somehow to marriage. You're assumed to be either unmarried, preparing to be married, currently married, formerly married. Whereas relationship status is already shifting the paradigm. It might lead to a list closer to this one, in which either has a current relationship or is somehow defined by the absence of any. But people's lives aren't arranged like this either. If you change the name, now you're really shifting the paradigm and the possibilities. And there's important differences in these and what we collect and what we set out to measure. Naming fields with great specificity up front is going to keep us on track, keep us honest, keep us collecting the data we intended to, and it's going to make our analysis later much more powerful. Lots of these statuses are overlapping. There's this sort of false premise that you're one at a time. If someone's widowed, is that their status forever? If they start dating, have they lost their status as widower? All the time we have more than one status going on, and they're all real to us. And some of them, to have to let go of that status, a declaration in public on some social app, is really painful. Some people really don't have more than one status. That's fine. All right. Take a really close look at this one. Can you spot the fatal flaw? All right, someone's got to shout it out. Yeah. So we have a one-to-one for something that's inherently a one-to-many. And of course, when I say one-to-many, we're talking now from the database standpoint, where it could be 1-to-0, 1-to-1, or one-to-many. But we're leaving open a possibility. Facebook isn't. This is them modeling relationships in a relational database completely wrong. This is what happens when you just make concessions by adding more list items, by not really thinking about what they're asking of you, what meaning is held behind the labels that they're lobbying for. So here are some takeaways. Modeling the real world is genuinely complex. That's okay. Assuming that we know who users are is surrendering our opportunity to learn who they are. Emergent data, discovery. Early constraints in the schema are netting us really crappy, misleading data. So we need to keep constraints out of that user schema at least for a little while, at least at first, so we can gather those initial responses. And finally, more free-form fields definitely are not going to hurt us. And potentially they have an opportunity to really be a better user experience. So data quality is improving because lies become merely optional, not required. We get data that's rich and specific, just like real life is. And we can unearth the patterns that are undetectable when that data is generic and constrained. We get to discover, we get to adapt, we get to be something that's closer to the real world and makes a community feel like home. And those are the foundations for really great user experiences. How did we do on time?
Very well. If we don't have a lot of questions from that one, I'll be quite disappointed. So we have quite a lot of time for questions.
All right. Woo.
Okay. So fantastic talk. Really eye-opening for a...
Can you turn up the volume on that mic? I can't hear it very well.
I cannot. It's going to have to be done at a panel somewhere.
So yeah, great. Eye-opening talk, especially for, middle-class, white, straight guy. So two little questions. Are there any libraries or standards or guidelines that I could kind of, refer to and refer others to? And the other one is, how do you deal with clients and especially, government organisations or even worse, marketers?
Okay. Yeah, let's take those one at a time. So as I said, I'm a Rubyist, so I cannot help you at all with what exists in the Python world. There are some interesting libraries in Ruby, some of which are adapted, I believe, from Perl libraries. And one of them has data sets around the world of names. So like birth registries, that kind of stuff, and uses that correlating with the gender put on the birth certificate and makes some probabilistic analysis to say, if you have a name like Judy, there's a good chance that that's a woman. So we can, make that assumption without having to ask. And then you get some like, say, Francis, where we might have to be a little more, we're gambling a bit. The problem is that not everyone identifies with the gender that they were assigned on their birth certificate, and also people get named funky things. Also, I come from a country that's pretty ethnically diverse, as do most of you. Just because in a really fairly homogenous society, you could say that it's likely that this name is attributed or connected with a certain gender, really doesn't work in a society where you've got a really ethnically mixed population. Those probabilities really get thrown out the window. I think those kind of libraries can be useful for things where you have no other choice, or where you're doing some of that auto-suggest, where you might set them up with a default that you think is reasonable, but allow them to change it. So, if you've got a really long form and you just want to give, some reasonable inputs so that they can just, move through it really quickly, something like that can have utility, but it can be really dangerous to use to basically tell people who they are, or do it behind the scenes. I think that's where it's most dangerous, is where we've never asked them at all and figure we can just, work this out with a good library. Does that answer the question well enough? Great question. Okay, so people who have ethnic descent from Spain and Portugal represent the majority of the world's population, and in those ethnic traditions, last names, family names, are incredibly complex. There isn't one name. There's a string of names that are coming from both the paternal and maternal side, and when you have to put something in a last name field, that becomes incredibly complicated for them. And usually what ends up happening is there's some sort of length constraint that messes with them, or there's some sort of parsing that assumes that a space means that, like this must be a middle name. And so they end up with, things like they end up having to hyphenate their name, which doesn't actually have a hyphen, just to keep us from parsing it wrong. Or they have to throw out a whole bunch of their names, which are, like, a tribute to their family. You're basically saying, like, I'm going to throw this side of my family under the bus for your form. And then you have billions of Asian populations where it's really common to have the family name first, That's not universally true, but it's true in a lot of Asian countries. So now if you have a field that's saying first name, last name, now they have to work out, do you mean you want to know my family name, or are you trying to find out what my legal name is? Because these are different answers. So first name, last name is a paradigm that really doesn't work in an international context at all. I really think that unless you have some reason where you need to say sort by last name or do searches that are limited like that you're really better off just having a field that says, what's your name? And be specific about what, like it could be, how would you like to be addressed? What name would you like to be addressed by versus, what's your legal name? What's the context that the app is inquiring? So if we can give them that kind of guidance, then they can give a better response. Okay, your second question was about monetization, and it's a great question, but other people have questions, so I'm going to try to circle back to that one. Yes?
Thank you very much for the talk. First of all, I must admit I hadn't considered these options, and I'd been working in the industry a while. I've done a lot of government work over the years, and identification has always been a big bugbear for them, and I think most of what they do with identification is based from a bureaucratic point of view on terror. And when I say terror, I mean the terror of being asked by a court who or what someone is. And so it is that these options become codified because the lawyers say, I need this. And if someone does something on your system which you may be liable for, if that's the way the laws work in your country, you've got to have some way of falling back to that.
So I want to address that part because it's really interesting. Australia, you should be so proud of yourselves because a court in one of the states, and I apologize, I don't remember which one, recently ruled that you can have a gender of not specified, that is a legal gender designation. This is the first time I've heard of any country doing this, but now already our schema has to change. Like that one person who won that lawsuit now has established that this is a valid value that has to be allowed to exist in our database. And there will be more. Was it? Okay, thank you. New South Wales for the video. Yeah, okay.
So, given, like you can...
Who's got the mic? Raise your hand.
That's me, sorry.
Okay, hi.
Given you can say, I accept these things as true, that there are no preconceived ideals, how do you convince your business analysts that that is true? How, when you draw a database schema and you always make sure there are less constraints and like kind of the get out of whatever, like get out of categorization options, that they won't just scribble them out and say, no, this has to be linked?
Yeah. We're pretty scared of our customers a lot of times, and we don't actually need to be. When you're dealing particularly with social data, you're usually dealing with big data. And the customer for that is really big data. They're squashing together data sets that are completely unrelated, that are collecting data in different ways, and they're really used to dealing with that. So the fact that we have data that is not really perfectly categorized is generally not a problem for them. At the small scale for an individual app, it may be something where you have to do some salesmanship within the organization. But I think part of that salesmanship should be, we don't know. We could be learning things that add more value, that bring more people in, that make them more loyal, that tell us that we have an audience that we could be going after much more effectively if we knew they were there. So the data can be really valuable. And it's hard because you do have people who are really scared, like, that'll be less data. And I won't be able to read it on, like a nice spreadsheet anymore. But I think we're also moving into a world in which this is much more accepted. Document stores, NoSQL, I mean, we're starting to really get more invested in unstructured data anyway. It's an interesting field. If you want to learn more about it, social big data and social analytics are the key terms to look up. And I also can give you tons of references to materials that I found. My Evernote is full of such things, and I'm happy to share. And I think that partially addressed the second question that you had. Is that now completely addressed? Okay. More questions? How are we doing on time? Are we out of time? Okay, sorry. I love to talk about this stuff. Please do find me this weekend. I am happy to field more questions. Thank you very much.
We're actually still good for questions. We're actually still good for question time if you want to continue.
Ooh, bonus. I'm excited.
All right. Okay, fantastic talk. And something that is struggling me a bit is the idea that we are losing a lot of cultural values, trying to...
I apologize, I'm going to interrupt. Could you speak louder, or can they turn up the volume?
Yeah.
Okay, try that again, please.
So yeah, something struggling me is the idea that we are losing cultural values, trying to feed all these people information right into these discrete buckets of information in the systems. And I face once living in a society where I'm Western and my data fits pretty well Facebook, right? This relationship that you show in there. And then living in a society that doesn't fit at all with the people. Yeah. And I face myself asking someone like, so you have, how many wives do you have now? Like, did you sell some camels and you have a new wife? No, because for Facebook it's not that cool. Like, it's pretty cool if I just have one. So I feel like we are losing some cultural values probably, and people is trying to fit into these whole systems and feel cool being on Facebook or things like that. So I'm very wrong about it. Like, what do you think? That are we losing values, or we should be optimistic and say whatever happens, happens? I don't know if I'm very clear. My English probably is...
I'm going to address some of the bigger points that you raised. Facebook, as humongous as it is, has in a number of countries and regions, they're basically running behind regional social networks that serve the local interests better, that recognize how that local community actually works. And so if Facebook were willing to give up a little of their tight reins, they could be in markets much more effectively if they were willing to look at what's actually there instead of telling you what you can be. And I think that's something that we can all do, is take a lesson from that, of that, you know, we can serve the market we know, but there's a whole lot of markets that we don't know and understand. And wouldn't it be great if our data was telling us what those are and who's starting to have interest? Are we going to turn them away, or are we going to be surprised?
We'll make this the last question.
Oh, sorry, it's not a question, it's just a comment, because I just want to defend the Django community, because that discussion about first name and last name, I don't know if everyone knows, was had recently. And in the new versions of Django, there is not first name and last name. What matters is short name, which is Dear X, Dear John or whatever, and long name. So the long name is one field that can be 10 names or one name or half a name or 3 names in any order, and that's what we decide matters. And I think that's the way that community is taking that particular dilemma.
And I'm sorry, can you clarify which community?
Django.
Django, okay.
Yeah.
I think that still has problems, because you need to add context to that for people. For instance, Japan, you've got some really structured social rules about how you address someone, that it's not just universally, here's my short name. And so you have to be able to inquire, or the user has to be able to inquire, you know, what is it that you want from me? And it may not be first name. It may be, what is the informal form of address that's okay to use?
Cool. All right. Thank you very much, Carina.
Ooh,
this is for you, some Norwegian blue coffee and a special PyCon AU
Well,
mug.
thank you.
And we'll be starting in about 5 minutes. Please give Carina a hand.